For such a relatively small island, there have been a huge number of great wrestlers to come from Samoa over the years. Sure, not all of them were born there, but with their heritage very much being Samoan, they still qualify as islanders. But just who are the greatest Samoans in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the biggest star of them all, The Rock. Yes, arguably the biggest name to ever come out of the wrestling industry, Samoan or otherwise, The Rock has pretty much been the poster boy for the famed Anoa'i family for years now. And that's led to him becoming a superstar not just in the ring, but outside of it too. Of course, for fans of this channel though, it'll be his in-ring exploits they'll be most concerned with. And these exploits begin during the mid-90s, back when the then rookie was going by the name of Rocky Maivia. Sure, this run wasn't exactly a great one for him to get started on, but by the time late 1997 came around, things would start to change as Maivia morphed into The Rock, a cocky heel who had all the charisma in the world at his disposal. And with this new character to play with, it wouldn't be long before he was turned babyface and rocketed up to the position of face of the company, with him at this point being the only man who could challenge the mighty Stone Cold Steve Austin for the spot of ace of Attitude Era WWF. But while both Austin and The Rock were pretty much equals in the ring, outside of the ring, Dwayne Johnson would go on to become a much bigger star. And that was because after getting into movies during the early 2000s, he'd eventually find his groove as the #1 action hero of his day in franchises like The Fast and the Furious and Jumanji. Then, when he wasn't doing that, he'd also be a hit in family and comedy films such as Moana and Central Intelligence. Obviously then, with all this success in Hollywood making him an even bigger household name, it was only going to be a matter of time before the People's Champion decided to take things back to his first love of the squared circle. And that's exactly what happened when, following a 3-year arc with John Cena during the early 2010s which saw him return to the ring for a couple of matches, Dwayne would return to WWE again in the early 2020s to introduce us all to his new gimmick, the megalomaniacal final boss, shoot member of the board of TKO, WWE's parent company. That's right, now as the actual boss in many ways, with him outranking even high-level officials like Triple H and Nick Khan, The Rock can pretty much call his own shots in WWE and do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And this has led to him giving a helping hand to his family by teaming with his cousin at WrestleMania 40. Who is his cousin? Well, he's our next subject as it happens, Roman Reigns. Yes, it hasn't always been an easy road for Roman Reigns to get where he was going. After all, those first 7 or 8 years where he was being pushed as the next top guy in WWE didn't exactly go well, what with fans rejecting him and all. Or at least they were rejecting what he represented because, with Roman always being a talented wrestler, it was clear after a while that audiences just didn't want to be told who their new hero was by Vince McMahon. They wanted to pick this person for themselves. But even if Reigns would struggle a lot during the 2010s, he would continue to be placed in a high-profile position. And in the end, he was able to turn things around with his Tribal Chief character. That's right, this was the most dominating wrestler we had seen since the peak years of John Cena. Someone so successful they were able to hold on to the undisputed WWE Universal title for a full 1,316 days. That said, it's not just the lengthy title reign which has led to the head of the table being so successful. No, there's also the fact his story with the Bloodline has proven to be the biggest story in years, probably the biggest since Austin vs. McMahon during the late 90s. So big has it been, in fact, at times it's felt like it's encompassed the entire roster as people like Drew McIntyre, Kevin Owens, and Cody Rhodes, just to name a few, got drawn into its orbit. Of course, whoever is drawn in though, the person at the center has always been and always will be Roman Reigns, as he is the Tribal Chief after all. But then Roman isn't the only notable Samoan to be a member of the Bloodline. No, some of his most prominent family members have also played key roles in that group. And of the other people who have played such roles, arguably none are more important than the Usos. That's right, it's a 2-for-1 entry, because while in recent years Jey Uso has been able to branch out and find success as a solo act, his legacy is still very much tied to that of his twin brother Jimmy's. But then how could things be any different when, for most of their careers, they've been joined at the hip as a tag team? And this has allowed them to find much success over the years, with them currently having 8 tag team title reigns to their name. And even when they haven't been holding the belts, they've regularly been able to steal the show against opponents like the New Day. Then of course, there's been the role they've played in the whole Bloodline saga ever since 2020. Really, it was them who got the whole thing going in many ways, as they were the first ones Roman Reigns tried to get under his thumb. And it was Jay's eventual breakaway from the group which led to him becoming a big-time singles star over on Raw, and the man who would go on to win the 2025 Men's Royal Rumble match. Where will that take him next? Well, possibly the World Heavyweight Champion, as that's the belt he's currently set to challenge Gunther for at WrestleMania 41. Really, it would be quite the fairy tale story if he was able to dethrone Der Ring General here and take home the gold. Obviously, though, this will leave his brother out in the cold, as there doesn't appear to be any singles titles in his immediate future. But that shouldn't suggest there isn't time for Jimmy Uso to have his big breakout singles moment too before all is said and done. And even if he doesn't get this, there's always the inevitable tag team reunion between the pair that we all know is coming one day. Who knows? At that point, maybe they'll decide to win the tag team titles a few more times and beat the record currently held by the New Day. Or maybe they'll start a trios division in WWE and bring their younger brother along for the ride with them, another Bloodline member. Hell, the man who actually took over the group at one point. That's right, it's time to talk about Solo Sikoa. Seriously, what a few years it's been for Solo Sikoa, as prior to 2021, few fans out there were even aware that the Usos had another brother. But when he signed on the dotted line with WWE at the beginning of the new decade, things would quickly move into overdrive for the rookie, as after a short spell in NXT, he'd be called up to the main roster to become the new enforcer of the Bloodline. And this was a role he excelled at, mostly by remaining silent and letting his fists do the talking for him whenever he needed to speak. Hell, there were times when even Roman Reigns would show some signs of deference to Solo, and that all suggested he was one day going to become the next tribal chief. Really, it was just a case of when he was going to choose to strike, with this time eventually coming after Roman lost the undisputed WWE Universal title to Cody Rhodes at WrestleMania 40. Yes, after Reigns took a sabbatical following his big loss, it would be left to Sikoa to pick up the pieces, much in the same way as Triple H did with D-Generation X once Shawn Michaels lost the gold at WrestleMania 14. But while Triple H's version of DX would arguably be even more successful than the original, the same could not be said about the Bloodline 2.0, as it's always struggled to find its footing, mostly because Roman Reigns was no longer there to helm the ship. And this would lead to Solo struggling to maintain the aura he'd built up previous to that after a while. Still though, even if his run as the new tribal chief wasn't the success some had hoped it would be, he remains a focused upon figure in WWE to this day. And given how young he is, he's going to get plenty of more opportunities to get things back on track as he becomes the true main eventer he's destined to be. That's right, it's still entirely possible that by the time something like WrestleMania 45 comes around, Solo Sikoa will be in that top spot in the main event scene, either as a heel or a babyface. And if this happens, we wouldn't be entirely surprised to see a current underling of his standing on the opposite side of the ring from him. Who would this person be? Well, it would be the only key member of the Bloodline we've yet to talk about, and the next generation of great Samoan wrestlers, Jacob Fatu. That's right, in a short space of time, Fatu has already proven himself to be an absolute phenomenon. But then this shouldn't be a surprising thing to learn to anyone who was a fan of his run on the Indies, as back then he was already a figure of great interest, someone on the tip of many fans' tongues as a guy who had a big future ahead of him. After all, there's a reason he succeeded in Major League Wrestling so much between 2019 and 2024, and there's a reason he'd be given both their world title and national openweight title during his run there. And that reason is because the Samoan werewolf truly is a superstar in every sense of the word. And he's been even better since joining the WWE. Yes, ever since his introduction, the Samoan werewolf has in many ways overshadowed everyone around him. But then this is to be expected when we're talking about someone with the level of talent that he has. Honestly, the only question left to be asked about Jacob Fatu at this point is how high he's going to go. Barring any catastrophic injuries, there really is no reason he shouldn't be a world champion before the decade is out. In fact, there's no good reason he shouldn't one day be the one to take the mantle of Tribal Chief from Roman Reigns, as he from there becomes the premier Samoan wrestler in the world. Or who knows, maybe Solo Sikoa will make a comeback and take that title for himself as was originally intended. This will certainly be the case if his father has anything to say about it. Who is that father? Well, he's our next subject as it happens. The one, the only, Rikishi. That's right, as the father to not only Solo Sikoa, but also Jimmy and Jey Uso, Rikishi has certainly had a major impact on the current landscape of WWE television. But it's not this most will remember him for when all is said and done. Rather, what they'll remember him for is the run he had during the Attitude Era. After all, it was there that as WWE's premier dancing Samoan, he managed to turn himself into a huge babyface star alongside his two cool stablemates, Scotty 2 Hotty and Grandmaster Sexay. Sure, much of his momentum might have been lost when WWE made the decision to turn him heel after trying to run over Steve Austin in a car, something he claimed he did for The Rock, but that doesn't take away from how big a part he was of that boom period prior to this. And that doesn't take away from the fact that even before he was a part of Too Cool, he was already a longtime member of Vince McMahon's roster, primarily as one half of the early 90s tag team, the Head Shrinkers, and during his brief run as mid-90s heel, the Sultan. And on top of this, he's a one-time Intercontinental Champion and three-time Tag Team Champion, as well as the fact that he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2015. Really then, it's hard not to consider the big man as one of the greats, as even in a family filled with as many stars as the Anoa'i clan, he still manages to stand out above most of the pack. Of course, the one thing we've still yet to see him do is make a modern-day return to the ring, possibly alongside one or more of his sons. But there's still plenty of time for that to happen, particularly as the Bloodline story looks set to keep going. And if he ever does inject himself into that angle as an elder statesman of sorts, we're sure fans will only be too happy to welcome him back into the fold, just as they've done in recent years with his cousin The Rock. One person who we won't ever see making a return to WWE for a role in the Bloodline, though, will be our next subject, and that's because he sadly passed away in 2000. Before this, however, he was one of the best to ever come out of the Isle of Samoa. Who are we talking about here? Why, Yokozuna, of course. Yes, while he was booked as a Japanese wrestler, the truth is that rather than hailing from the land of the rising sun, Rodney Anoa'i was a proud member of the Anoa'i family, and, as such, of Samoan heritage. That's right, we're talking about a guy who made an instant splash both literally and figuratively after debuting in the WWF in late 1992, as after only a few months on the roster, he'd be winning the 1993 Royal Rumble. And with this being the first year the Royal Rumble winner got to go to main event WrestleMania to challenge for the world title, it meant Yoko would be standing across the ring from Bret Hitman Hart at WrestleMania 9. Of course, those who thought this was going to be just another routine defense for the excellence of execution were very wrong in their assumptions here, because by the time it all was said and done, it would be Rodney who was standing tall as the new champion and the first heel to ever win in the main event of WrestleMania. Sure, he would lose the belt moments later to Hulk Hogan, but by the time King of the Ring came around, he'd be in possession of the gold again. And this would be the start of a 280-day run on top, something which was almost unheard of for a heel in WWF at the time. For this reason alone, then, Yokozuna has to be considered a legend. But that wasn't all he did during his career, because once he dropped the belt back to Bret Hart at WrestleMania 10, he'd continue to be a fixture in the WWF for a few years yet, primarily in the tag team division, where he became a two-time tag team champion alongside Owen Hart. Sadly though, by the time the late 90s were coming around, weight issues had caused Yoko to balloon up to a mammoth size, way more than was healthy. And this would eventually see him part ways with the WWF, as he instead spent his final few years working on the indie circuit. And not long after that, he'd pass away at just 34 years old, way too young for anyone to go. Still, even if he is gone now, he would get his WWE Hall of Fame induction in 2012, so his legacy remains intact. But let's move away from stars of WWE for a moment and on to a Samoan legend who spent much of his career in other promotions, the man known as Samoa Joe. Sure, he might not be a member of the famed Anoa'i family, and he may never have been involved in the bloodline in any way, but in Joe Sanoa we have what is one of the best of his generation, someone who's succeeded everywhere he's worked, usually by going all the way to the top of the card. And we mean this genuinely because as far back as his early days in places like Ring of Honor, he was great. Hell, it was his 645-day-long reign as ROH World Champion which helped to legitimize that company back during the early 2000s, and it was his bouts against the likes of CM Punk, Nigel McGuinness, and Kenta Kobayashi which gave us some of the greatest in-ring moments of the era. Of course, there's far more to Samoa Joe's career than just his time in Ring of Honor, though. No, there's also his lengthy run in TNA where, again, he helped to take that promotion to the next level during his series of matches with Kurt Angle in 2006 and 2007. And when he wasn't doing that, he was dominating their X division as a 5-time champion, all while even finding the time to become world champion on one occasion. Where would he go from there? WWE, of course, or specifically NXT, as in the black and gold brand he managed to rise all the way to the top of the card all over again as a 3-time world champion. And after his time was done in NXT, he would go on to have a great run on the main roster too. And then in 2022, he'd move promotions all over again when he'd join AEW. And it's been there that he's proven age is just a number because despite now being in his 40s, he was able to beat MJF at World's End 2023 to add yet another world title to his list of accomplishments. But let's move away from the present day for now and back to a past time again, a time when Vince McMahon Sr. was still running the WWF and the bloodline of the Anoa'i family was still yet to be fully established. That's where we'll find our next great pair of Samoan performers, a team aptly named the Wild Samoans. Yes, before Roman Reigns was dominating WWE TV, his father was making a name for himself there too. And that father was a man named Sika, someone who, alongside his brother Afa, made up the duo of the Wild Samoans. And they quickly rose up the ranks of the tag team division in the WWF to the point that they'd become 3-time tag team champions before all was said and done. But it wasn't just WWF that Afa and Sika excelled in. No, with this being the territory era where there were a lot more places to earn a living as a wrestler in North America, they had points branched out into other promotions too. Needless to say then, this would make them legends of their time, so much so that their runs would represent the beginning of a lineage which is stronger than ever today. So legendary would the Wild Samoans be in fact. In 2007, WWE would induct them into their Hall of Fame. And even as recently as 2020, they'd be making cameo appearances on WWE TV to anoint Sika's son, Roman Reigns, as the new tribal chief of the family. Sadly though, with both now having passed away, there's no chance of seeing them appear again anytime in the future. That said, at least their legacy is being kept alive by the head of the table. And that's not the only legacy Roman Reigns is keeping active today. No, he's also doing the same thing for his brother, himself a former WWE star who passed away all too young in 2017. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Rosie? Yes, many fans will be aware that Rosie was the older brother of Roman Reigns. Unlike with Roman though, Rosie wouldn't be working for WWE during the 2010s and 2020s. Rather, his run would come before that during the early to mid 2000s. What was he doing back then? Well, initially he was playing the role of a member of 3 Minute Warning, the duo of heavies who were brought in during 2002 as Eric Bischoff's personal attack dogs, and that would lead to him and his partner Jamal finding a lot of success. Not that they'd win any titles or anything, no, this wouldn't come until a little bit later for the Anoa'i family member, but what he was able to do here was fully establish himself as a force to be reckoned with on the Raw roster. So when Jamal left WWE in 2003 then and Rosie was repackaged in the more comedic role of superhero in training sidekick to the Hurricane, it didn't dampen his career as it could have. Hell, it helped his career in many ways because it was while teaming with Shane Helms that Rosie finally won Tag Team Gold. And now that he was a champion and still felt like a physical threat, no number of capes and cowls were going to turn him into a complete goofball. Where would his career go from there then? Well, to another company as it happens, because after being cut from his WWE contract in 2006, he'd venture out east for a while to get over in All Japan Pro Wrestling. Following this, well, sadly things would take a downturn, as with his health starting to falter, he'd be limited to working on the US indie circuit. And while he would do well there, he's unfortunately passed away in 2017. Obviously then, with him only being 47, it was a real tragedy, particularly for his brother, who was just starting to rise to the top of the card in WWE and wanted his blood to be there with him to enjoy the moment. Of course, he's not the only Samoan who was succeeding in WWE during the 2000s, because while he was running things over in the tag team division with the Hurricane, our next subject, Umaga, was making a play for big-time singles stardom as a top-level heel. How did Umaga manage to do this? Well, after first getting noticed back during the early 2000s, he'd get a shot in the WWE as a tag team act alongside Rosie. That's right, in a prior life, Umaga was actually the Jamal half of 3 Minute Warning we spoke about a moment ago. Once 3 Minute Warning came to an end though, the American Samoan would spend a few years outside the WWE working for places like TNA and All Japan, with this allowing him to keep his profile up high enough that by the time 2005 rolled around, Vince McMahon would come calling once more. This time though, the boss didn't want Jamal anymore. No, he wanted Edward Fatu in an all-new role as an Islander named Umaga, and this new gimmick worked out great. So much would it work, in fact, he'd soon find himself thrust up to the main event scene as he took on John Cena for the WWE title in what was at the time possibly Cena's best ever match. Sure, he wouldn't win this feud or the belt, but hanging with the champ showed that the big man had what it took to be a player. And this was why he'd continue to get semi-prominent spots in the WWE over the next couple of years, as he feuded with the likes of Kane, became Intercontinental Champion for a while, and at one point even got involved in the Battle of the Billionaires at WrestleMania 23. Unfortunately though, by the time 2009 came around, it would all come crashing down for Umaga, as that was when he found himself being cut from his contract, with this coming only a few months before he would tragically pass away. But even if he is now gone, Umaga remains a legend amongst Samoan wrestlers, just as everyone else we've talked about today is too. And given how many great Samoans there have been in the industry over the years, that puts them in very hallowed ground and makes them truly special athletes indeed. Athletes who can rightfully call themselves the pride of the islands.